we go. Okay, so following this event, you'll be able to find a link to the recording of this talk on our website by the end of the day. In addition, in the chat, I'll also be posting a link where you can buy the book, Weaponized Words, Strategic Role of Persuasion in Violent Radicalization and Counter-Radicalization. And then you can use the code WW2020 to get 20% off when you check out. So with all of that said, I will now turn things over to Bill to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Eva. Hi, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. We've really been enjoying putting on this webinar series, and I hope that you'll continue to be able to make it. Really excited today to introduce a friend and colleague, Dr. Kurt Braddock, who has written a book that was just begging to be written, and I'm glad he did it. Dr. Braddock is a former START Terrorism Research Award winner, so we take great pride in all the things that he's accomplished since then. He's an assistant professor of communication, arts and sciences, and homeland security at Penn State University. Although imminently, beginning in the fall of 2020, he'll serve as an assistant professor of public communication at the American University. His research focuses on the use of communication theory to explain psychological phenomena related to terrorism and political violence, including violent radicalization, counter-radicalization, and disengagement from violent activity. His work has been published in Terrorism and Political Violence, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Dynamics of Asymmetric Conflict, and several other communication and security-focused outlets. Dr. Braddock advises multiple policymaking entities, including the Department of State, the United Nations Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, and the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Homeland Security. So Kurt's going to give a reading for us, as well as give an overview of the book, and then he's left a lot of time for us to engage in Q&A. So please send me your questions in the chat function. I'll try to group them and tee them up so that we can get as many answered as possible. Kurt, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Bill, thank you so much. I really appreciate what you're allowing me to do here. I very much appreciate START hosting me, and I think this is my almost 10-year anniversary of being affiliated with START now. So I'm very pleased to be able to do this, and I'm very happy that START was willing to host me and do this. I'm very pleased to have written this book. I am humbled that Bill thinks that it's something that was begging to be written, because it was really just something of interest to me more than anything else. But what I'm going to do today with respect to the book, because I do want to leave a lot of time for Q&A, is to go over the book in a little bit of detail. I'll go over every chapter, maybe 2 or 3 minutes for each chapter, give you an idea about what it's about. And then from there, I will do a very brief reading from the book, maybe another 10, 15 minutes, which is, it's going to be a strange experience for me. I've never done an actual book reading before, but I'm excited to try it. And then I will be more than happy to take your questions. So I'm going to share my screen now, and Eva, let me know if I screw something up or something otherwise goes wrong. So you should be able to see my screen now. Nothing embarrassing on the screen, which is good. And now I'm going to minimize this so it's not all up in your face. Okay. So, as Bill said, the title of the book is Weaponized Words, the Strategic Role of Persuasion in Violent Radicalization and Counter-Radicalization. On the right, you'll see the cover, which I'm very pleased with what Cambridge did with respect to the cover. I designed the cover, but they styled it up a little bit. But aside from this, let's get into the meat and the potatoes of the actual book. Before I start, I should preface it by saying the way the book is written, and this was more for my sanity than anything else, was to break it up into 3 pieces. It made it seem much more manageable to break the book up into 3 different sections. The first being what I call the battlefield. This relates to the foundations of persuasion and the foundations of radicalization and counter-radicalization. So the first part of the book is a bit of a necessary evil, kind of going over the ins and outs of what we know related to persuasion theory, how persuasion relates to radicalization, and what's been tried. So the first chapter relates to defining what radicalization is and what counter-radicalization is, so we can kind of draw some operational boundaries around what it is I talk about for the rest of the book. The main takeaway from this chapter, and I've had some pushback on it, and that's understandable, but it's more a function of my coming from a communication and persuasion background, is that I understand radicalization and counter-radicalization to be a persuasive process. Now, just like terrorism, which is a huge definition for terrorism, which is a huge topic of debate right now, there are literally dozens of definitions for what radicalization is, what counter-radicalization is, what de-radicalization is, and all of the related processes. I look at radicalization and counter-radicalization as being a process of persuasion, because within communication science, we understand persuasion to be simply the exposure to ideas which changes your beliefs and attitudes in a given direction. A very basic idea there. And when we break radicalization, which I define as somebody's change in beliefs, attitudes, intentions, and or behaviors such that it aligns with a terrorist ideology that supports violence, that when you relate it to communication literature, that is a persuasive process, generally triggered or at least affected by exposure to messages, whether they be interpersonal, online, static, dynamic, Web 2.0 based, anything like that. Communication science would consider that to be a persuasive process. That's not to say that radicalization can't be defined in different ways and that other processes don't affect it. It's just that for the purposes of my analyses in the book and for my research, I look at it as a function of persuasion. Moving beyond the definition of radicalization and counter-radicalization, I think before we talk about what can be done using communication theory and persuasion theory, we need to understand kind of where we've been with respect to counter-radicalization. So chapter 2 does a bit of a literature review and looking at the different kinds of counter-radicalization efforts that exist or have existed thus far. There are 3 general categories that I look at. The first being what I broadly call training, education, and support. And this kind of encompasses efforts that when people are recognized as being vulnerable, they are taken in and go into classes, they are put into social groups, are offered support by NGOs, civil society members, things like that. Those can incorporate persuasive elements, but aren't always exclusively geared towards persuasive messaging. A second strategy that's used, which is kind of on the fence with respect to whether we consider it strategic persuasion or not, is a denial of access efforts. This relates to Twitter taking down posts they think advocate violence. It relates to closing down Facebook groups and things of that nature. I don't go into this too much because this is much more of a legal debate than it is a theoretical one, but it's important to recognize that these denial of access efforts are often used in conjunction with counter-radicalization efforts that focus on persuasion. And finally, where I focus most of my efforts are these messaging efforts, ones where campaigns are built around persuasive messaging intended to get somebody to change their beliefs and attitudes. So with those kind of foundational issues out of the way, I move on to what I think is the most interesting and exciting part of the book, and that is the application of existing persuasion, communication, and psychology theory to the understanding of how violent extremists try to get people to adopt beliefs and attitudes consistent with their ideologies, and how counter-terrorists, analysts, policymakers, and practitioners can use these same theories to develop messages of their own for the purposes of counter-radicalization. So the second part of the book, which has 4 chapters, I call the weapons, the things that are used in this fight for strategic influence related to radicalization and counter-radicalization. And what the first chapter in this group that I look into is kind of the my safe space, so to speak. It's kind of where I cut my teeth in terrorism studies, that being how terrorist groups use narratives for the purposes of changing beliefs and attitudes, and how counter narratives can be used for the purposes of preventing the assimilation of those beliefs and attitudes. Now, this is kind of old ground here. Literature on narratives and counter narratives has been relatively, I won't say the same, but with the same idea, we see the same ideas circulate, and we see the same ideas evolve over the last, say, 5 to 10 years. But in this chapter, what I look at are the ways that terrorist groups, specifically white supremacist groups, single issue groups, Islamic fundamentalist, jihadi groups, how they use narratives, or how they have used narratives to persuade individuals that are exposed to those narratives to assimilate ideas that are embedded in those narratives. And for the purposes of counter narratives, if anybody in the audience there is familiar with my research, you know that I have done quite a bit of work on the development of counter narratives, and a lot of what appears in this chapter reflects my work in that sphere. Chapter 4, which reflects my current line of research, relates to an idea called attitudinal inoculation, which has a decades-long history within communication science. Attitudinal inoculation is kind of a psychological analog to medical inoculation, in that the idea is that if we expose somebody to a small dose of an idea and make them think that their beliefs and attitudes that they currently hold are at risk of changing because of exposure to this belief or attitude that somebody will espouse, they're more likely to hold on to the beliefs and attitudes that they already have. So in essence, we're giving a tiny dose of a message we want people to resist, and they develop counter arguments on their own. Now, this is, I think this theory was founded in persuasion literature in the 1960s, 1961 or so. And after decades of research, there is ample evidence to suggest that attitudinal inoculation is very effective across several domains. And I've recently completed an experimental study where I tested inoculation in the domain of violent extremism and found that it's also effective in that domain, in that if we expose people to terrorist propaganda, and we tell them that this terrorist propaganda is so persuasive that it can change their beliefs and attitudes, they're much more likely to hold on to what I call their safe beliefs and attitudes. These attitudes that don't advocate violence. So this chapter gets into how we can develop effective inoculation messages for the purposes of counter-radicalization, and how terrorist groups have, maybe without knowing what inoculation theory is, have in effect also developed their own inoculation messages. So moving forward from here, we go into chapter 5, in which I talk about reasoned action theory, which is kind of a combination of the theory of reasoned action and the theory of planned behavior. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar, this is reasoned action theory. The idea is essentially based on a psychological idea that our behavior is affected by our intentions are affected by our attitudes are affected by our beliefs, and our beliefs are affected by background factors. Now, this is not a communication theory in and of itself. However, it gives us some idea about where we can target persuasive messaging to prevent the adoption of beliefs and attitudes consistent with terrorist ideologies. And the example that I use in the book to illustrate reasoned action theory relates to a hypothetical individual named Mark with these background factors that lead to beliefs about behaviors consistent with engagement in violence on behalf of a white supremacist group or a neo-Nazi group. Now, like inoculation theory, there is a strong basis for the predictive value of reasoned action theory. And I think that there is a case to be made that there are several inflection points in this schematic which describes the way that people come to engage in certain behaviors where we can apply persuasive messaging to prevent the adoption of beliefs and attitudes consistent with terrorist ideologies. And we do see the application of some counter messaging programs that are drawn from reasoned action theory, perhaps without explicitly saying so. Now, chapter 6, which is often my favorite topic I teach my students, relates to discrete emotions. Now, in this chapter, again, not a specifically communication-based theory, but again, one more based in psychology and understanding of affect. I talk about how emotions have different motivational properties. And again, like inoculation, like reasoned action theory, there's a long history of research showing that emotions can be used or can be exploited to get people to adopt beliefs and attitudes consistent with certain behavior patterns. Now, this chapter features several examples of terrorists trying to evoke certain emotions and examples of practitioners or how practitioners can evoke emotions for their purposes. So here, some of the examples that I used in the book relate to how terrorist groups evoke things like pride. And the still that you see here is a still that does appear in the book. It is from an ISIS propaganda video from, I believe, 2014 called Blood for Blood, which features a number of child soldiers of ISIS essentially rising up from the rubble of a destroyed city to fight back against the Westerners that destroyed the city. And there's a lot of imagery that is meant to evoke pride in the particular ISIS ideology, or the particular ISIS brand of Islam. There, I talk quite a bit about fear and how terrorists use fear appeals to get people to adopt their ideologies. And what you see in the middle is a still from the video version of the manifesto by Anders Breivik, who was the perpetrator of the 2011 Norway attack on Utøya. In his manifesto, which itself was, I think, 1,400 pages, but was described by investigators as being very rambling and not terribly coherent. But if you see the video, it was meant to project the manifesto and advertise the manifesto, but it serves almost as a synopsis of that manifesto. You see in that video a lot of imagery that relates to fear of infiltration by the other. And that's what we see here. Breivik's ideology surrounded the idea that that Norway and Europe at large was being infiltrated by Muslims, and that those that lean to the left of the political spectrum are what he called cultural Marxists, who are going to rape Europe and allow Muslims to infiltrate, what he said was an infiltrate Europe and take over culturally. So a lot of the imagery in the video is meant to evoke imagery that, or evoke feelings that relate to fear about that potentiality. There's also, especially among the radical right in the US and elsewhere, the attempts to evoke guilt through a sense of duty. And what you see on the right is a placard put up by the American Vanguard, a white supremacist right-wing group. I believe this was put on a bulletin board at the University of Texas at Arlington, if I'm remembering correctly. But this is meant to show how terrorists try to evoke sense of guilt and motivate individuals to behave in ways that are consistent with the ideology of the terrorist group by making them essentially feel guilty and get them to do so. Now, I said that practitioners can use the same emotions for the purposes of motivating people to avoid beliefs and attitudes consistent with terrorist ideologies as well. And some examples I use here, again, on the left is a still from a video from an old campaign called Say No to Terror, though you can still find them on YouTube. In this particular video, which was, I believe, made during the Iraqi insurgency, and the transition of Al-Qaeda in Iraq to ISIS. There was a video that showed that Iraqi citizens can come together and fight against terrorists that are ruining their country. In the center is a advertisement for the Life After Hate program. That program is, and the advertising for it is meant to give people who may have already gone down an extremist path a bit of hope, so that they hope that they can then change their ways and get back to some semblance of normalcy, and reclaim their life and take back what the extremist's life has taken from them. And on the right is a video still that was taken by many outlets in the Middle East to show what ISIS had done to a Jordanian pilot who was downed in, I believe it was in Syria. It was an infamous incident in which ISIS created a video in which he was put in a cage and lit on fire. This backfired against ISIS in a way because Jordanians were outraged by this. And the still here is meant to show how practitioners and policymakers can use or evoke anger to get people to disavow terrorist ideologies or to adopt beliefs and attitudes that are inconsistent with terrorist ideologies. Now, with that theory, or with those perspectives out of the way, I move on to the final part of the book, in which I call it the war, meaning the ways that I speculate that terrorist groups will stay for their positions and how we can fight back against that. So in the final 2 chapters of the book, I look at the direction at which communication technology is driving the persuasion literature, and think about ways that we'll need to consider the ways that terrorists persuade their audiences and how we can persuade our own. So the first one that has come to the fore, and I wrote this chapter 2 years ago now, and in the last even just 2 years, this has really come to the fore as something that's become a huge threat in the United States, especially, elsewhere as well, but in the United States, there's a huge focus on disinformation, especially online, both from foreign and domestic actors. So online disinformation has already been shown to promote violence against civilian targets. On the right is the Pizzagate shooter. And for those unfamiliar, the Pizzagate disinformation fiasco was based around the idea that in a pizza restaurant in the DC area, there was a child trafficking sex ring that was run by the Clintons and the Clintons' allies. So this was spread, I believe it originated in 4chan or 8chan or Reddit or one of these dark circles of the internet, and it gained traction among some audiences. And as a result, one individual decided to travel to this pizza place with a couple of firearms and fired at the pizza place. Luckily, nobody was hurt, but this example illustrates the ways that disinformation can motivate individuals to engage in violence on behalf of the ideas that are espoused in that disinformation. One form of disinformation that I am personally most concerned about moving forward are deepfakes. And deepfakes, rather than explain what they are, let me just show you a video clip, and then I'll explain why I believe deepfakes pose a threat to our security with respect to what extremist groups can do with them. And Eva, let me know if this doesn't work. It should, though.
Hey folks, I'm Joe Biden. I'd like to ask you to join. As I've said,
we're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or how about this? Simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. It's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources. It may sound basic, but how we move forward in the age of information is going to be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become some kind of fucked up dystopia. Thank you. Stay woke, bitches.
So, I thought that was a good way to illustrate what deepfakes are without going into detail and ruining the surprise for you. The reason that I feel that deepfakes pose a threat to domestic security is because of the idea that when individuals are killed by terrorist groups, or when terrorist groups need to make statements from public figures, or if terrorist groups need to show their purported constituents being victimized by individuals who never victimized them, deepfakes can make this possible. The scariest thing about deepfakes to me is how fast the technology is becoming available to just laypersons, and how easy that software is to use. And some of you may have seen that clip in the past that I just showed, but for those of you that didn't and didn't recognize that it wasn't President Obama, you can see how persuasive or how convincing those sorts of messages can seem. So I think deepfakes are a place we need to start looking at potential threats to our security, and we need to start thinking about ways that we can counter those deepfakes. Finally, an area in which I'm starting to look is something called stochastic terrorism. And the idea of stochastic terrorism comes from statistics. A stochastic process is one that is not possible to predict when and where an event will occur, but it will reliably occur. So the idea of stochastic terrorism is that when public figures make statements that advocate violence, even implicitly, if they don't say it overtly, if they don't say you should attack person A, B, or C, or institutions D, E, or F, but they make certain implicit or implied suggestions related to violence, when they have such a broad audience, there is likely to be at least one or two individuals within that audience who are going to adopt or are going to take that message literally and as a call to action. Now, the still that I see on the right, or I show on the right, is something from several years ago now, where President Trump tweeted an image of him attacking a figure with CNN superimposed on the head. And this, again, he could say, I'm just joking, I'm being sarcastic, but images like this and the continuous showing of images like this and statements like the press is the true enemy of the people can increase the possibility that somebody will engage in violence on behalf of the individual or the group making those statements. Full disclosure, I'm working on another book specifically related to stochastic terrorism. So in chapter 7, I almost preface that book or start with where that research is going with respect to the book that I'm getting into. There are a lot of issues with respect to stochastic terrorism concerning free speech, if and where there are boundaries, and those are things I'm getting into. But for the purposes of this book, I just want to talk about the ways that implied messaging can persuade individuals to adopt certain standpoints. And finally, the final chapter of the book is how we can fight back using strategic messaging. One way in which I believe that we can fight back with strategic messaging is through the use of virtual reality and other immersive technologies. In chapter 3, I talk about narratives and counter narratives, and there's been research to show that they can be persuasive under certain conditions. In my work on narratives and counter narratives, I show that there are several processes that facilitate persuasion via narratives, one being identification and perspective taking. So I argue that using virtual reality and other immersive technologies, we might be able to develop effective counter narratives that go a step further than written or spoken counter narratives can. There is some work within communication science on the persuasive efficacy of immersive technologies, but it's just getting off the ground, and I think that it's a very fruitful way to direct our attention. A second are things called entertainment education campaigns, which are very closely related to related to counter narratives. Oftentimes, when people understand counter narratives, they think of kind of one-off stories. However, anybody growing up, when I grew up in the 80s, 90s, probably even the 2000s, remember what were called very special episodes, or very special series of episodes on TV shows we enjoyed. Generally, these are those episodes where there is a character arc where maybe somebody becomes addicted to drugs and then understands the evils of drugs, and then they come off drugs and they learn a lesson at the other end. So rather than be a one-off narrative, entertainment education campaigns are meant to entertain individuals, obviously, but it's over a larger arc of individual narratives or individual stories. These have been shown to be effective in other domains such as health communication, political communication, and others. So I think that we should look into sustained entertainment education campaigns to the degree we can for the purposes of counter-radicalization. And finally, going back to our childhoods, if anybody remembers the Choose Your Own Adventure books, and that's what we have on the right, there's no unicorn to solve counter-radicalization or terrorism. But there is a concept called self as source that I've started to look into, and something that I think could be promising for the purpose of counter-radicalization. Something that I found in my research, no matter what context, I found that individuals tend to adopt beliefs, attitudes, intentions, and behaviors consistent with messages that are espoused by sources they trust. Source credibility is a critical element of any message delivered in any context, especially one that's as politically charged as radicalization or counter-radicalization messaging. However, something that hasn't really been looked at is the degree to which we might be able to use internet technologies, Web 2.0, and immersive technologies, as previously mentioned, and getting people to write their own stories. And one way you can do that is through an interactive story in which a person goes down their own path by their own choosing, rather than read a story that's been dictated to them. So in this way, they act as the source of their own story. However, we can strategically develop these messages so that whatever path they choose, they adopt the message or they encounter the messages that we want them to. So these are just 3 ways that I talk about where we should point our research and think about different types of strategic counter-radicalization messaging. And of course, these are not exhaustive. They're not mutually exclusive. There are dozens of other ways we could go. But these are just 3 ideas I've been thinking about with respect to fighting back against terrorist ideologies and their strategic messaging. So from there, if I may, I'm going to try not to feel too awkward about reading from my own book, but I will do a reading here. I feel like if you don't have a cup of coffee, that you should grab a cup of coffee if you can. Turn up your computer or so. And what I will read is the opening couple of pages from the chapter I have on narratives and counter narratives. And rather than bore you with the theoretical stuff, well, exclusively theoretical stuff, each chapter in the theory chapters, or each beginning of the theory chapters, has a vignette to illustrate what it is I will talk about in the chapter. So for our purposes here, you'll get a vignette, and then I will talk very briefly about one part of narrative theory, and you'll see how it goes into the chapter. So, if I may. It was barely after 10 in the morning, and Highway Patrolman Charles Hanger, who is pictured right there, was already having a busy day. About an hour before, an explosion rocked the city, and he was ordered to connect with his command post there. But shortly after beginning his drive south, he was reordered to turn around and head back north. The command post in the city had all the help it needed. Hanger complied and turned around. There would be plenty more to do in that morning. Driving back up Interstate 35, he took notice of an old, pale yellow Mercury Marquis. The car was unremarkable except for one detail that happened to catch his eye as he sped past it. It was missing a rear license plate. After nearly cruising past the Marquis, Patrolman Hanger slowed to match its speed. Once alongside it, Hanger looked over and nodded courteously at the driver. The person behind the wheel, a young, clean-shaven man of no more than 30, nodded back. Hanger slowed even more, pulled behind the Marquis, and turned on his flashers. After the Marquis settled to a stop on the side of the interstate, Hanger pulled his car beside it. He opened the door and emerged from the vehicle. Hanger noticed the man he pulled over was also getting out of his car, which made him nervous. People who get pulled over typically wait in their cars for officers to approach. Given that another patrolman had been shot at during a routine stop just weeks before, Hanger was wary. He stayed behind his open car door, placing a barrier between himself and the man who was now moving towards him. After a few seconds, Hanger left the safety of his car door and approached the man. Moving forward steadily, he announced the reason for the stop. "You don't have a license plate." "Huh," the man said, turning around to look at his rear bumper. "No." In a short discussion that followed, Hanger discovered that the otherwise unremarkable Mercury Marquis was not insured or registered, and the man he pulled over was carrying a loaded pistol for which he had no in-state license. Hanger led the man to the back seat of his patrol car and went about the business of searching the Marquis. In the front seat, Hanger found a baseball cap, a sign that read, "Please do not tow," and a large white sealed envelope. He took note of these items and returned to his prisoner, preparing to transport him to the county jail about 20 miles away. Hanger asked the man if he wanted to get anything from his car before they left, just in case there was something valuable in the envelope the man might need. The man was short in his response. "No," he said, "leave it there." Investigators would later examine the contents of the envelope, finding written quotes by the likes of Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, a copy of the Declaration of Independence, a justification for war against those that restrict liberty, and a long passage from William Luther Pierce's The Turner Diaries. The passage read, "The real value of our attacks today lies in the psychological impact, not in the immediate casualties. More important, though, is what we taught the politicians and the bureaucrats. They learned this afternoon that not one of them is beyond our reach. They can huddle behind barbed wire and tanks in the city, and they can hide behind the concrete walls of their country estates, but we can still find them and kill them." The Turner Diaries is a novel that describes an armed resistance against government that seeks to outlaw firearms and restrict liberty among its people. In the story, this resistance, which promotes the killing of blacks and Jews, culminates in bomb attacks against FBI headquarters and other government buildings. Investigators found that the Turner Diaries was a personal favorite of the driver of the patrolman hangar pulled over on Interstate 35. The man was Timothy McVeigh. When he was stopped with an excerpt of the Turner Diaries in his front seat, he was driving away from an attack on a federal building in Oklahoma City. Just an hour before he was pulled over, McVeigh murdered 168 people in that attack, including 19 children. Leaving a passage from the Turner Diaries in his car was no accident. McVeigh wanted those pages to be found. They told the story that inspired and justifies the largest domestic terror attack in the history of the United States. They weren't just part of a random anti-government narrative. They were his manifesto. They explained why. The subsequent investigation and testimony provided at McVeigh's trial showed the extent to which the Turner Diaries shaped his beliefs and attitudes, as well as how much they inspired his plot to bomb the Murrah building. McVeigh first encountered the book in his early days as a U.S. Army infantryman. Consistent with the book's central theme, he came to believe that the United States was threatened by a collective of, quote, money-grubbing liberals, multiculturalists, and Jews intent on stripping citizens of their basic rights. Of great concern to McVeigh was the possibility that the U.S. government would eventually come to take away citizens' guns, just like in the Turner Diaries. McVeigh gave the book to several people whom he thought might share his concerns and his worldview, including Terry Nichols, his key partner in the Oklahoma City bombing. The pair were struck by the book's revolutionary tone and believed it foreshadowed the future of the U.S. McVeigh and Nichols came to believe that the plot of the Turner Diaries was playing out in real life in September of 1994, when President Clinton approved a 10-year ban on assault weapons. Immediately after the ban was enacted, McVeigh began to search for the bags of ammonium nitrate that would be used to construct the bomb that tore a hole in Oklahoma City. What began as a grudge against the United States government for its sieges of Ruby Ridge and Waco came into deadly focus when real-world events mimicked a story that McVeigh identified with. How was this possible? How could a story, even one as politically charged and hate-filled as the Turner Diaries, help motivate someone to kill dozens of his fellow citizens? How could any story help shape beliefs and attitudes that promote violence? And if stories can push someone towards violence, can stories be used to pull someone away from violence? The answers to these difficult questions can be found in an area that's been studied by communication experts for decades. Research has shown that stories are strong tools for persuading people to adopt certain beliefs and attitudes, or even engage in certain behaviors. Most of this research is not focused on political violence, but as issues related to terrorism and national security have become increasingly prominent around the world, experts have come to realize the capacity for narratives to carry terrorist ideologies and motivate terrorist violence. Luckily, some communication researchers have realized it's possible to beat terrorists at their own narrative game. Just as terrorist groups distribute their ideologies and motivate would-be terrorists through their stories, counter-narratives can be used to challenge those ideologies and promote peace over violence. For these reasons, it's critical to understand how narratives are used in the context of terrorism. This chapter tries to achieve that goal. More specifically, this chapter discusses the nature of narrative persuasion, how it's been used to promote violent radicalization, and how it can be used for counter-radicalization. To these ends, this chapter describes the mechanisms through which narrative persuasion occurs and demonstrates how terrorists have used narratives to achieve their objectives. Most importantly, however, this chapter explains how counter-terrorists and analysts can use their own narratives, called counter-narratives, to challenge terrorist propaganda. But first, it's important to clarify what we mean when we talk about narratives and narrative persuasion. The next section will define these terms and lay the foundation for effective narrative persuasion that may help keep the next Timothy McVeigh from acting out a violent story of his own. So from there, I go into the foundations of narrative persuasion, the mechanisms of narrative persuasion, and so on. So each chapter in the book starts with something like that to illustrate the ways that communication theory can show the way that terrorism has played out, and how we can use communication and persuasion theory to understand these phenomena. So I will stop there, but I will leave my contact information there in case anybody wants to get in touch beyond the Q&A session, for which I think we have 20 minutes. So I think I can take some questions. I will stop my share now and hopefully not hit the wrong button.
Thanks, Kurt. So we do have a bunch of questions already that have come in, and several of them are around inoculation theory, which is certainly one of the reasons I was so excited for this book when I heard it was coming out. I think this has just tremendous amount of promise, and I think if we embrace it, it can help us be much more effective in the way we think about our messaging strategies, our educational curricula in elementary and secondary schools. Right, I think there's a lot of room here. But one of the questions from the audience is just, could you explain it a little bit further? How does it work? And specifically regarding inoculation, is it accomplished via the shock factor associated with being directly exposed to the propaganda and being told it's wrong? Or does inoculation involve a more complex process that breaks down and explains the elements of information operation being conducted against the would-be recruit? For example, are the meaning and intended effects of the imagery used in the propaganda explained to the person being inoculated? Thanks.
Yeah. So, I mean, Bill, you know that inoculation is kind of my bread and butter. I love inoculation as a theory and as a practice. So I'm glad that somebody asked that question, kind of how it works. In the context of radicalization and counter-radicalization, and given the study that I did recently related to inoculation, which formed the basis for this chapter, I found that inoculation prevents persuasion through kind of two routes. Number one, well, let me start by saying how an inoculation message is constructed, and that'll explain why the two routes are what they are. The main mechanism by which inoculation works is the elicitation of threat, especially in Western countries. There is a cultural component here that I get into in the chapter. But generally speaking, people don't like being told what to do. And when they think that their beliefs and attitudes that they currently hold, which form the basis for their identity, are under threat of changing by somebody else's ideas, if they think that somebody is going to come and change their beliefs and attitudes, people tend to kind of bunker in and hold on to their beliefs and attitudes and resist what comes their way. So I found the paths of this kind of counter-influence to go through two things. Number one, when you inoculate somebody, they experience what's called psychological reactance. So if we tell somebody that somebody else is going to come and try to persuade you of something, if we say that white supremacists are going to come to you, and we know that you're not racist now, but they're going to come to you, and this has been persuasive for people just like you. People like you have adopted white supremacist ideologies on the basis of what these people coming to you have said. People experience what's called reactance, which is a combination of anger toward or arguing. And these are so entwined in terms of their effects. The research has shown that they can't be torn apart. So people experience these two things simultaneously. So what happens is when you inoculate somebody, you can give them an initial kind of shock factor, as the audience member said. You can tell them what their idea or what the propaganda is going to do and tell them. But the idea isn't to tell them every bit of what the propaganda says. What's interesting about inoculation is that it shows that when you inoculate somebody, just like the body builds up antibodies in response to a small dose, the body builds up psychological defenses in the same way. So if you tell somebody that neo-Nazi groups are going to come to you and tell you that Jews are taking over the mid-Atlantic or some ridiculous claim along those lines, and we know that you don't believe that, and you're right for not believing that, but we want to warn you because your beliefs and attitudes are under threat of changing because we know people like you have changed your mind on the basis of being exposed to this. The research shows, and what my research shows, arguments organically. They'll listen to what you have to say, and they will build on that in the same way that their body builds antibodies against a disease, whether it be a virus or a bacteria. So reactance via counter-arguing and anger is one way. I also found that when you tell somebody that their beliefs and attitudes are under attack, or they will be under attack, they tend to believe that the group that will attack their current beliefs and attitudes, they believe they'll be less credible. So they attribute less credibility to the group that's going to persuade them. So you can get these preemptive reactions from an audience to react to the message before it hits them, so it bounces off them, hopefully. Now, what you said, Bill, I think is absolutely right, because the question is that I always get is the key here then to be first? And yes, inoculation, you need to be there first, which is why I think it's so exciting for school curricula and for children and people who haven't been kind of drowned in ideology yet. Now, that said, some people say, can you inoculate against an inoculation message? And you can. There's a phenomenon called the possibility of how you inoculate against messages where terrorist groups say that we're lying and that we're going to come to them. So it goes down kind of this rabbit hole, but there are different paths of research that we're looking into where there are other ways that it's counter-influential as well. And if I can, just one last note about inoculation, the reason that I like it so much, especially with respect to communities that are often, they're criminalized or they are unduly thought to be overly vulnerable to violent radicalization. One of the things that I really like about inoculation is that you can go to those communities, and rather than go in an accusatory tone and say, you're going to become a terrorist and we think that you're vulnerable to this, you go and you say, we know that you hold safe beliefs and attitudes. We know you're not violent. We know that you don't adhere to terrorist ideologies. But we know that these other individuals are going to come to you and try to persuade you to adopt their ideologies. And some people that have been exposed to these messages have gone down that path. And we want to help you maintain the safe beliefs and attitudes that you already have. So rather than criminalize certain populations, you become an ally to them. And I think that's very exciting and very useful, especially given the history of some counter-radicalization campaigns, which have inadvertently criminalized certain populations, and as a result of that, have been less effective than they could be.
Thanks, Kurt. So just one follow-up question on inoculation from the audience, and it was, can you provide more concrete examples of terrorist organizations using inoculation theory, or is there any evidence that they have? And while you're thinking about that, I'm reminded of Anwar al-Awlaki's March 2010 speech to the American people, in which he says some really insidious things. To American Muslims, he says that, don't take comfort in the kind words of a neighbor. Don't wait, they're coming for you. They're coming for your religious freedoms. And just like America used to be a place of concentration camps for Japanese Americans, soon it will be a place for concentration camps for Muslim Americans. Basically planting the seed that every time a neighbor embraces you as a neighbor, it's actually part of this trajectory towards them coming for your freedoms. He lays this trap. And I just remember that one and thinking, God, that's so insidious and clever.
Yeah, I mentioned al-Awlaki in the book as well, but the example that I think is most illustrative is the aforementioned Anders Breivik, who bombed Norway, because in his manifesto and in the video synopsis of his manifesto, he often warns of politicians in Norway and in the West generally of saying, they're going to tell you it's for your own good. They're going to tell you that this is going to benefit the economy. They're going to tell you multiculturalism benefits everybody who's involved with it, but here's reasons A, B, and C why it's not. So just like al-Awlaki, Anders Breivik, he laid this foundation to preempt any messages that left-leaning politicians in Europe or in the United States might put out there. So he's trying to preempt those messages, or he tried to preempt those messages through his manifesto, very much like al-Awlaki did. So it's very much about warning. You see it from terrorist groups quite a bit, warning, knowing that governments are going to try to counter those messages, so they try to undermine those messages before they're delivered. And al-Awlaki was, you hate to say he's a master at anything, but he was a master at that. He was very effective.
Right. So there was I'm trying to find this interesting question about emotions. I think
Sure.
Another reason I was excited about the book is just I think we fundamentally, as professionals, as counterterrorism professionals, downplay the role of emotions. And we also do it as behavioral and social scientists. But we sort of leave the arts and the humanities out. I think we undercount or discount the role of cultural artifacts in extremist movements, whether that's white power music or anashid or clothing lines, but this sort of the creation of cultural artifacts, the creation of culture, I think, plays on people's emotions in really interesting ways, giving them a sense of identity and empowerment. And I think, you know, we downplay that to our fault and think more about other kinds of more concrete enabling factors, like, say, inequality or poverty, or these other issues, when sometimes I think emotion is more critical. And let me just find the question.
While you find it, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the word you used there was empowering, and that's something that we see quite a bit with the development of these cultural artifacts, the development of a shared identity around symbols, whether they be, like you said, clothing, music, or anything. They're developed expressly so people can feel pride about a particular ideology or adopting a certain ideology. So this kind of psychological element, the sense of identity, and the emotional element, the pride around that identity, work in hand to motivate action on behalf of the ideology.
Okay, so here's the question. I would love to ask Professor Braddock, when looking at emotional messages, are appeals to a common shared identity more powerful than a self-focused identity, e.g., like being physically strong as an individual? And being more specific, is there a difference between collective pride and individualistic pride in terrorist messaging? Thanks.
This gets at exactly something I said earlier, where I kind of brushed past it to say that a lot of these are culturally dependent. And I mentioned that in the book as well, to say that in Western cultures, individualistic pride, you're going to see them being much more effective than in collectivist type cultures. So white supremacist groups in the UK, the US, Germany, you're going to see within the white supremacist propaganda there, much more individualistic calls to action. I mean, there is a sense of shared identity among individual actors, but calls to action are often much more individually based, and they're based much more around kind of the development of self. So you can be this great person. You can self-actualize if you adopt this ideology and engage in a behavior on this behalf. Whereas in some more collectivist cultures, which maybe aren't completely collectivist, but many cultures in, say, the Middle East, there's much more of an emphasis on things of becoming something bigger than yourself, be part of this movement, and be part of this larger machine in which we have this shared identity, and together we can move this identity and this movement forward. So, it's by no means a black and white thing. You see individualistic appeals in collectivist cultures and collectivist appeals in individualist cultures as well. But you do see just what you said, Bill, and what the person who asked the question said, is that there is this difference, and the effectiveness of the emotional appeals, whether it's individual based or collective based, very much depends on the culture in which it appears and the audience that's being targeted by the messaging. That's a fantastic question, and it's something that I actually say in the book that needs to be considered with every campaign that's developed. Culture affects everything, and we need to understand that when we develop these sorts of messages, and not just kind of throw things at a wall and hope it sticks.
Right. So I just want to point out to the group, we've got about 3 minutes left on our scheduled time. Kurt, if it's okay, I'll volunteer you to stay a few minutes longer.
I'm happy to, yeah.
Want to remain on. We certainly have a lot more questions. So there's an interesting question about misinformation. And let me just preface this, right? A great researcher named Kate Starbird has done, I think, a really good job explaining that one of the things that disinformation does, it's not just that these are lies that change the way you think about an issue, but oftentimes they just muddy the water. Right. Mm-hmm. The end result is that you don't know what is right. You don't know what's factual. You don't know what's not factual. And you just get frustrated and you just sort of give up on the whole issue, or you just retreat to whatever belief is most convenient for you because it's too much work to sort out what is accurate and what's not accurate. So I think in the current environment, this is really important to understand how disinformation and misinformation functions. Mm-hmm. The question is, does your book explore ways to counteract the spread of misinformation, specifically deep fakes? Can inoculation theory be applied to the spread of deep fakes?
This person answered their own question exactly the way I would answer it too. But there is a bit of a caveat to that too. Yes, inoculation I think is a fantastic strategy for combating disinformation, and I may be working on a research project right now related to that. May or may not be. I can neither confirm nor deny. But the tricky part is that for something to be inoculated against, we need to understand it first. And a lot of times, misinformation and disinformation appears organically on the web, and it's difficult to identify it and develop counter messaging to it before it's already kind of out there and it's too far gone to inoculate against. So yes, that I think the person asked the question is absolutely brilliant in what they think in that inoculation would work. But the key is to identify kind of organic emergence of disinformation quickly enough to be able to develop inoculation messages to it before it reaches too many people. Now, this is where things like artificial intelligence and kind of deep learning algorithms can come into use. This is where the social scientists like me can team up with the computer scientists who I do not understand, but I think there's a lot of room for collaboration there to do this sort of thing. And I do also know that there are individuals that work in the artificial intelligence and deep learning type technologies who have developed algorithms for identifying deepfakes as well. So there are little things in deepfakes you can identify that show it to be a deepfake. So as a concrete example, social scientists could partner with individuals who have developed the technology to identify deepfakes on the basis of certain little graphic ticks that our human eye would recognize. So if we can identify those things, we can incorporate that into an inoculation message and then distribute that to vulnerable audiences. So I think there needs to be collaboration between kind of the quote hard sciences and the quote soft sciences there, especially with respect to AI and communication researchers. But yeah, inoculation I think would be the first line of defense for this sort of thing.
So there's a question about a couple of questions about sort of augmented reality, virtual reality, or immersive technologies. One, okay, perhaps these may be viable tools in more wealthy developed nations, but in the developing world, or the question specifically mentioned India, a place that has huge numbers of terrorist attacks every year, a huge population and not necessarily resources. Could you just reflect on that, right? What are some alternative vehicles or technologies, means to engage in some of the counter narrative work or alternative narrative work?
Okay, so absolutely, yeah. Again, like I said, everything is culturally dependent, and in a world that's kind of bound by resources, so are the things that we can do to use our resources that we have to counter terrorist narratives. There are other things that we can do, or things that communication research has shown can make certain narratives more effective. Something that might be like a kind of a lo-fi version of augmented reality would be something like 3D in a visual narrative. That wouldn't cost as much as an complete immersive technology, but it's been shown to get people to have certain psychological responses like identification with characters and transportation into the narrative itself to a greater degree than just kind of a static film. Something I think, getting back to kind of basic narrative theory, that I think would be useful in places where maybe these sorts of things aren't possible, is just a deeper understanding of the audiences that are targeted by the counter and alternative narratives. A lot of what drives the effectiveness of narratives generally is the degree to which which the characters are built upon archetypes that the audience can identify with. And sometimes we don't develop narratives with that in mind. We don't consider the audience. We assume that they will identify with the character, but we don't develop the character on the basis of what we think the audience will identify with. So I think just getting back to basics can help in those instances as well. So audience analysis as best you can, I would say, is critical, not just in kind of lesser developed countries, but for everybody, because a lot of people don't do it well. And things that facilitate transportation into narratives as best they can. Another real simple example would be when showing a visual narrative, do it in a quiet and dark room so people aren't distracted. It seems very simple, but things like psychological transportation into a narrative, which has been shown to be a persuasive mechanism of narratives, is largely dependent on the degree to which somebody's not distracted. So just simple things like that can be useful.
Sure. I just had a really interesting phone call several weeks ago with a woman who runs an NGO doing rehabilitation reintegration work in Lebanon, and they use plays. Having individuals participate in a play, sort of role play, in which they can identify with the characters that they're playing, and those characters are three-dimensional. They think critically. They change their destiny. They don't just succumb to black and white extremist propaganda or narratives. And role playing and seeing, again, that sort of self as source idea is a really interesting work. I've got to go back to inoculation theory.
Of course.
When an inoculation message is delivered, what is the impact or result when it's been delivered to an individual or group that has already been indoctrinated to terrorist beliefs and intentions, right? So can it be used as a part of off-ramping and or rehabilitation?
I would not recommend using inoculation as a form of off-ramping. It's primarily used as kind of the first attempt at keeping somebody from adopting a viewpoint. It really is funny the degree to which psychological inoculation matches the idea of medical inoculation. Like, you wouldn't inoculate somebody against a disease if they've already caught the disease, because it's not going to work. The same thing happens here. I think there has been some research to see whether or not an inoculation message would work in terms of getting somebody to move away from particular beliefs and attitudes, because there are certain beliefs and attitudes or ideas that overlap. So maybe somebody hasn't been exposed to a belief or attitude that's within kind of the sphere of the overall ideology. Can you inoculate against that? And it's been shown that inoculation isn't effective in that way. So the greatest value of inoculation is getting there first, or at least getting there at a point by which somebody hasn't already been indoctrinated. So unfortunately, inoculation, I don't think, would be as effective for people who've already gone down that path.
A question about ethics. How does the differentiation between persuasion and manipulation play in your research and the ethics of the field? Thinking of manipulation as covert persuasion, that is, the individual is not aware of the counter messaging occurring.
I mean, in terms of the ethics of giving somebody a counter narrative, for example, the whole idea behind a counter narrative is that it's supposed to be covertly persuasive. In terms of doing like research and field research, of course, I have to follow all IRB protocols. I have to make sure that everybody is at least aware of what's going on, that they're in a research study. But for some of these persuasive messages to work, the whole point is that they have to be covert, because people are protective of their beliefs and attitudes. Where I draw the line in terms of whether a persuasive message is ethical or not is whether or not it will do harm to the individual, whether or not it is likely to cause that individual to do harm to somebody else, or whether or not I try to involve individuals in my research who are fundamentally familiar with the ideology that I am working in. So I don't kind of inadvertently but covertly instill my values on another individual with respect to religion or culture or something along those lines. So it is a delicate balance to draw, but some messages are meant to be covertly persuasive, one of those being narrative and counter-narrative. Because if somebody is aware that a narrative is persuasive or there's a persuasive message in it, they're unlikely to engage with it to the degree that they can be for it to be persuasive. So really, it's a matter of weighing the overall benefit of the covert persuasion against the danger posed by not using that persuasive messaging in the first place.
Right. It's obviously a huge complicating factor for any government actions in the space then, right? And it suggests that the role of civil society is huge in this arena.
And I found too that some of the most effective counter messaging does come from civil society. It's not from governments. It comes from civil society, small NGOs that are embedded in the communities that they want to help, because those sources are often, even by those who have already gone down a trajectory towards joining an extremist group, they tend to trust the individuals within their own communities, even if those individuals and those groups are speaking out against the path they're on. So those civil society members, I think, should be the focus of these sorts of campaigns.
There's another question. Has any of this information been shared, vetted, discussed with the law enforcement community, such as the FBI, or those agencies, any of those agencies striving to prevent racially motivated violent extremism?
Yes, some police, but often, trying to think how I can explain this without, I don't know if I would get in trouble by saying who it is, but it's not anything cloak and dagger. But I mean, as you said, the organizations that I've worked with, like the House of Representatives Committee for Homeland Security, I've briefed them on, for example, the inoculation work that I do. When I finished the experiment, I put together a 1 to 2 page brief for them to show them what happened, and they were curious about inoculation, so I came and I briefed them on what it is. The counter narrative stuff that I've done, I have presented to the Department of State, just again to give them a grasp of why just telling any story is not going to be effective. So yes, absolutely. I think that the purpose of any research that I do, and this is mostly just a fundamental value of my own, is that it should be valuable to the practitioners that need it, to keep them safe and to keep the individuals that we're targeting with these messages safe as well. Because in a way, I think a lot of the individuals that we're targeting with these messages are victims in their own right, because they are recruited and radicalized by these individuals who do not have their best interests at heart. So I try to brief NGOs, civil society members, governments that need this sort of information to better produce messages that don't criminalize certain populations and can better structure their messages. So I don't know if vetted is the right word, unless you consider vetting through social scientific inquiry, but it definitely has gotten into the hands of practitioners in a way that I'm comfortable with.
Thank you. Well, I think we've covered the waterfront on questions. So at this point, I want to thank everybody for hanging with us for an extra 10 minutes. Kurt, thank you for spending your time with us. Thanks to the START team for putting on the webinar.
And Bill, if I may, one last thing, let me close this. I think you can keep talking. Don't mute yourself. I'm going to put up my slide again with my contact information, because somebody asked me to put up my contact information.
Yeah, of course. Just thanks to the START team for another smooth webinar. And please do engage with Kurt. Please engage with START if there's any follow-on questions that you have. We like to hear from you and engage with you. So thanks again, and we will see you next time.